Okay. All right, guys. Well, good evening. It's my pleasure to moderate tonight's discussion about cannabis law for the Armenian Bar Association's Young Attorneys Division. Tonight's webinar is the fourth in a series of emergent practice area webinars that the Armenian Bar Association has put together, starting in May 2021. So the first webinar was on cryptocurrency and blockchain technology. That was back in May. The second was on climate change and environmental law in June. The third was about cybersecurity and data privacy last month in July. And today we're saving the best for last in August, where we're going to really run down the emergent area of cannabis law cross-border, both north in Canada, in the United States, and all over the world. Just as a quick heads up for lawyers practicing in California and I believe Ontario, this webinar will qualify for 1 hour of continuing legal education, which is super valuable. And if you're watching this in December, hi, I'll probably be watching this as well because I'm always catching up at the end of the year. So my name is Mark Cavdar. It's my pleasure to moderate the discussion. I have three wonderful panelists here with me that I'll introduce, and I figure we'll have the conversation go pretty fluid and talk about sort of the high-level interface of how cannabis law is this broadly defined thing and how that comes to life through the introduction. So a little bit about me to start as the moderator. My name is Mark Cavdar, as I said before. I currently work in a quasi-legal practice, more so commercial role, that built on the experience that I built in 4+ years of basically regulatory, corporate, commercial, securities, all facets of cannabis law at a number of licensed producers in Canada. So I've been at MedRelief, was briefly at Aurora, was at Afria prior to it becoming Tilray, and just before entering my current role at Nova Cannabis Inc., I did about 1.5 years at Canopy Rivers, which is now Riv Capital. So the number of companies that I've worked at in the 4 years should give you a sense of the pace and speed of which the cannabis industry and cannabis law itself is changing. And I'd like to introduce our panelists this evening. We've got Aram Ordubegian. He's the chair of Arent Fox's Cannabis Law and West Coast team leader for the Bankruptcy and Financial Restructuring Group at Arent Fox. Aram is here. We've also got Mr. Basmadjian, who is a senior associate in the Litigation and Dispute Resolution Group at Dentons Canada LLP. His practice involves a number of complex corporate, commercial, and civil litigation matters, of which many intersect with cannabis law and people who are currently in the cannabis space. Finally, our third panelist is Narineh Khodadadian. She's an associate at Shevin Law Group's transactional and cannabis business law practices, specializing in business formation, regulatory compliance, and related transactional matters. And that is the boring part, because what's really going to tease out the fun is going to be the discussion that we have about cannabis law. So just to start our sort of webinar and our panel and our program this evening, I figured it'd be a good way for our panelists to talk about how their practice and their established expertise interfaces with cannabis law. And we'll start with Aram on that.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be here and share some of my experiences. I've been a bankruptcy and restructuring lawyer for second week of law school, believe it or not. And about 4 or 5 years ago, this opportunity arose to practice much more in the cannabis space. I think you're going to hear from the rest of us that we've come to the cannabis law practice area from other areas. But specifically for me, before you can be a bankruptcy lawyer, you have to be a startup lawyer. So you have to birth the company before you could kill it. And then, especially in a Chapter 11 case, it emerges out and comes back and becomes a startup again. So for many years, I was doing outside general counsel work as well, being a startup lawyer, but the startups did not have money or enough money to pay me. Well, that all changed with the green rush. Cannabis companies, startups had the money, had the wherewithal. They were able to hire advisors and attorneys. So it's been great. And since then, as the companies have become much more sophisticated, They have all the real life problems other established companies have. They need corporate lawyers, real estate lawyers, restructuring, bankruptcy lawyers, intellectual property lawyers, et cetera. And that's how the cannabis law space is now intersected with all of the other existing legal spaces. So happy to be here with everybody.
That's great, Aram. Yeah, and you're talking about the idea of intersection of existing legal spaces, I imagine, as more and more people realize this isn't sort of a panacea where they get to, decide they're into cannabis and then collect checks. Their expectations may come into conflict with reality, and at which point they would hire somebody like Ara.
That's right.
Thank you, Mark. That's quite right. And my practice as a corporate commercial litigator intersects with the cannabis industry in the sense that I routinely advise cannabis companies and their officers and directors on class actions, corporate governance, regulatory, and a host of risk management issues. So that's how my litigation practice intersects with cannabis.
And firsthand, I can attest to that in terms of just the strong presence of capital markets at every single one of these cannabis companies and the idea of where the capital comes from. So often you have a sort of an interesting management team that comes along from a production and supply chain perspective that lacks the sort of, what would you say, the respectful way to say it is the sharky, capital markets lens. And then when you marry those two worlds, it often leads to very exciting outcomes. And I'm sure that Narineh can attest to working at her firm and the people that she works with in her practice as well.
For sure. Thank you so much for having me. I started in cannabis law during law school, so I was very lucky to see the emergence and transition that cannabis law has taken. I was lucky enough to take a class in law school that taught us just the basics about cannabis. I found this law firm that's, I'm hired there now. It's amazing. So I've actually grown into it. The legal adult market here in California began in January 2018, and I got hired January 2019. And I'm just seeing a lot of the changes. I think Aram had previously mentioned, cannabis companies are becoming a lot more sophisticated. So predominantly what I deal with are more complex agreements like mergers, acquisitions, a lot of intellectual property agreements like trademarks, patents, trade secrets, a lot of offtake agreements, employee leasing agreements. I don't want to say too much, but it's definitely a very interesting type of law to practice because you do need to know a little bit of everything to be able to solve these issues in this really gray area that we're in right now.
So if I'm hearing correctly, we've got insolvency, startups, class actions, capital markets, civil litigation, corporate commercial, standard, everything from the IP, employment matters. There's all kinds of stuff for cannabis. Like cannabis law is basically going to be an intersection for law in general. It's going to be sort of its own pillar, onboarding this, heretofore verboten substance into our legal and regulated supply chain. One of the things I can actually attest to here, I got into cannabis here in Canada in 2017 prior to legalization. And this is one of those moments when it was a federal medical scheme. So you would basically have a one-to-one relationship with a licensed producer who you would use your constitutional right and basically ascribe to them to grow your medical cannabis on your behalf. And once that, and I think everybody can attest, and Aram will get to this in a second, is once you kind of create that framework for a medical system, the train's left the station insofar as access and control framework. So then so all that's to say, there's a regulatory piece to this that's quite fascinating. And that's kind of how I got into cannabis law, because I actually started my career in highly regulated industries. So I'd done a few stints in financial services at the Bank of Montreal and also at a tobacco company where I got kind of how the regulatory framework works. And what fascinated me about cannabis prior to full legalization in Canada was the idea that here was something that was being transacted in a completely dark supply chain that there was no oversight over. There was no product quality affirmation standards. There was just, meeting a guy in a dark Starwell or in a Mazda 3 parked on the outskirts of a movie theater at 10 p.m. on a Friday. Not using personal examples from any life experience, just what I've heard through the grapevine. And all of a sudden you've got this, very exciting, very dynamic, and all these people who had heretofore not even understood what cannabis was or what made it good were, well, there's an opportunity here and there's something to learn. So watching that evolution of the populace and that constant tension between the people who are like business people and then cannabis people, and the regulatory frameworks that govern both of them have been fascinating, and it's still a work in progress. And I think that actually leads us to our first discussion point for this evening's webinar, is the idea of legalization. And full federal legalization, what that looks like, what that entails. So in Canada, we went, kind of setting the table for that, we went from a full medical scheme into a full recreational scheme. So it was, from a regulatory perspective, rather clean. And clean is, again, a word that I would rarely use in any sort of legal context. But obviously, south of the border, I don't think it's going to be the same way, because you've got this great federal-state divide that I still learn about every day. And I think we'll look to the expertise of Aram and his team to guide us through what to expect from the federal legalization when it eventually does arrive in the United States, and what that means.
Yeah, happy to do that. And I do think that for sort of young attorneys, new attorneys, this cannabis space is perfect, because you could become a mini expert in it much sooner than in an established space. So this is perfect, and especially seeing the three youngins on this, Mark, Narineh, and Ara. It's nice. You're a perfect example of this. So the more you're in a gray zone in the law, is it legal, is it not legal, the more work there is, quite honestly. So from a purely lawyer perspective, you don't necessarily always want black or white rules, right? But look, the reality is we're eventually going to get there. And many of the states, a majority of the states in the US have either decriminalized cannabis, or they've authorized some medical or recreational use. I mean, that's a big deal. And the problem is there's a big difference between the states, which becomes a problem, of course, when you consider what Mark was saying, that this is actually a business also. You've got states that are fully adult recreational, California, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, several of them just pop into mind. You have others that are just medical only, and you actually end up having a cooperative relationship with a specific plant that is grown for your benefit. You have a hodgepodge of other states that say they're medical, but they don't enforce the recreational side, which is actually the worst of all worlds. It's a de facto legalization, but you really want consumers to be in that type of a market. And then lastly, you've got the sort of the crazy reefer madness states where if they smell it on you, you're going to jail for many years, right? So there has finally been a push by the various stakeholders, be they advocates, business owners, elected officials, and the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act is circulating around the Senate. It is highly likely it will pass. It's very much supported, and it's really being driven by the states, telling the federal government, do something to help us out, give us some uniformity. And if enacted, it will decriminalize cannabis as a controlled substance. It will expunge certain prior criminal convictions that are out there. It will set a 21-year-old age for the use, a lot like alcohol, right? It will take away cannabis regulations from the Drug Enforcement Agency and put it under the FDA, put it under the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Again, just like alcohol. And it will set up a tax that will be collected and create a fund that will hopefully help underserved communities that were hit very hard by the war on drugs, so that there's actually grant money to allow some of those areas to enter the green rush, as I was saying earlier. Just a couple quick points about it. States are still going to have rights in the sense that they get to control if cannabis use is legal or not. However, the major difference is going to be that states will not be able to prohibit cannabis from passing through their states. So you can, have the setup now where you grow it in, let's say, Oregon, and you sell it in California. By the way, that's happening right now, but at least it'll be legalized. The taxes, the taxes are going to be 10% the first year, and then going to go up to 25%, which is very, very crazy. We've seen the tax differences, at least in California, to encourage the gray market that still exists, because there still is illegal cannabis out there that is way cheaper than the ones from the dispensaries.
No, Aram, that's a very interesting point, and it's an extremely important issue that's occurred in Canada, where there's still this robust underground market. To what extent has that been explored as a policy concern in California?
Yeah, in California, it's been a major problem, and I want to hear what Narineh's experience has been too. I have clients who hire us to deal with the city attorney's office because they have spent time and money, received a license, opened up a dispensary, and then almost literally across the street, an illegal one opens up. They undercut them, and it takes the city, the county, whatever enforcement mechanism you have in the state you're in, many weeks, if not months, to shut them down. And on again, pure business level, that's just not okay, right? You can't, it disencourages folks to follow through on the regulatory rules that Mark was talking about. So some of this pressure to make it federally legal or have guidance within individual states is from the ground up. It's businessmen and women saying, we need some clarity here.
Just to kind of piggyback off of that, what's interesting that's happening in California right now is there was a merger of all three state agencies. There are three separate agencies regulating the market depending on what kind of cannabis activity you participated in. Along with that merger, what California is doing is they're providing over $100 million to local municipalities to get people licensed. Right now in California, I think the traditional market boasts about $8 billion in annual sales, while the legal market is close to $4 billion. And what basically I think is happening is there's a push to get people licensed, hopefully give these businesses tax breaks. Unfortunately, with cannabis, it's the most regulated industry. It's so taxed. Depending on what city or county your client wants to get licensed in, you need to look at the taxes because they vary from city to city, county to county. It's a lot, but what the state and different municipalities, especially in Los Angeles, what they are doing right now is there is a push for legalization. There's a push to get businesses money so we can move towards from the traditional market to the legal market. Because what we are finding from research is that the biggest market right now is women and people over 60 years old. So it's more beneficial to have a legal store that these people can enter into and get licensed, clean product that's reliable and safe for consumption. So I think the government is actually taking some sort of real initiative to make more positive changes. I don't know if you guys know about this, but I think it was just last month, or it may have been this month, but there was the biggest, I'm completely blanking right now. I think it was a $1.2 billion seizure of cannabis out of Antelope Valley, if I'm not mistaken, and that was just recently. So, I mean, from what it seems like in California, there's a very heavy push towards legalization.
Yeah, and Mark, that's in line with that. What's going to happen is once you have an equal playing field, federal legalization, it's going to encourage sort of safer banking. It's going to encourage more of the established businesses to come into the space. I'm making this up, but the Pfizers of the world, Philip Morris's of the world
Yes.
can come into the space. Maybe our smaller startups aren't going to like that. Maybe they'll cash out and make a lot of money because of that. So it could be a win-win situation. So there is a business justification now to make it legal across the country. And by the way, going back to you, Ara, and you, Mark, about Canada, America has lost a lot of M&A work and going public IPO work to Canada, okay? Because they weren't able to go public here. They went to Canada, and that's not good for us lawyers, of course, so.
And that's actually a great segue, because Narineh hit the nail on the head with respect to like how you migrate illicit operators into the legal channel. And it's capital. Ultimately, it's the idea that, well, what I used to do was I'd go get these cool nutrients that this guy told me were going to make my cannabis grow awesome, and I would get a room in my basement that was sparsely used and, you know, do the thing down there. And I would do it, you know, in a really creative and awesome and beautiful way that would lead to wonderful product that had, you know, frosty trichomes that smelled amazing. But when you ran it through a certificate of analysis, if it's like, oh, I think this is like 30% rat poison, you might not want to consume this. Not to slander any illicit market operator, but there's all kinds of that people just don't understand what, oh, the other word for this is butane. Is that bad? You're like, well, in a certain circumstance, it can be. So that idea of migrating the illicit operator, or the legacy market consumer, who is like the forebar of this and who really built the idea of what's good about cannabis into the legal market, is one that requires capital. And Aram, you nailed it with the idea of, well, Canada kind of ate the United States' lunch with this little arbitrage opportunity. Shout out to the Canadian Securities Exchange and the TMX Neo Exchange, two places where a number of junior securities lawyers cut their teeth here in Canada. But Ara, I'm curious if you've seen kind of the other shoe drop in Canada where, I mean, there've been a number of scandals. Thankfully, one of the companies I've never worked at was CanTrust, which I think is ironically named licensed producer here, where they committed some allegations. There's allegations that they committed some fraud. So now that we're kind of into the green rush, and it's not such a forward-looking panacea, and I know I've used that twice on this webinar already, I apologize, but this kind of green bullet for prosperity, how has that affected you step into the situation when people, you said I would be X by now, and really you actually committed fraud. And so now how is that sort of factored into your practice, and what kind of advice do you have to management teams and young lawyers even looking at the need to generate capital and to create capital in the space with that same let's say diversity of actors and the high risk and shifting dynamic of the regulatory environment, all in scope of your advice?
That's a great question, Mark. I mean, class action lawsuits against cannabis companies are certainly on the uptick in Canada. So the proliferation of these kinds of lawsuits can be attributed, I think, in large part to industry growth, market volatility, and corporate scandals, as you had suggested. Now, while product liability and data breach claims are also engaged in these kinds of things, more and more we're seeing Canadian cannabis companies and their officers and directors being the target of securities class actions in both Canada and the United States. So securities class actions most typically arise in the primary market, such as in the context of an offering, including an initial public offering under a prospectus, or trading in the secondary market through the stock exchange. So securities class actions have been commenced against cannabis companies usually after financial restatements and a subsequent decline in the share price. The claims most frequently focus on trading in the secondary market and generally involve allegations of misrepresentation in financial statements, undisclosed related party transactions or benefits, inflated asset valuations, exaggerated operational capacities, and non-compliance with regulatory requirements. So for example, a highly publicized filing in Canada alleges that a licensed producer of medical cannabis falsely represented to the capital markets that it was complying with all legal requirements applicable to the growth and sale of cannabis, when in fact, the company was illegally growing cannabis and storing cannabis in unlicensed rooms. So similarly, recent filings in the United States have focused on allegations that cannabis companies and their officers and directors misled investors or failed to disclose significant problems with their businesses. So you asked me what can companies and young officers and directors do to protect themselves from a successful claim? Well, I think officers and directors should always consider whether the company has sufficient controls over financial reporting or whether additional measures can be implemented, whether timely disclosure of material changes to the company's business, including earning projections that may have been impacted by COVID-19, reviewing existing disclosure for compliance with accounting standards, securities law, of course, avoiding conflicts of interest, especially when you're dealing with things like executive compensation and related party transactions, establishing a special committee when you're investigating internal issues, having that special committee retain external counsel, employee education, training regarding the company's obligations under securities law and in Canada under the Cannabis Act and its regulations, creating an anonymous whistleblower system, implementing strong regulatory compliance regimes and culture, encouraging consulting with legal and financial advisors on material issues that can generate risk, and as easy as it sounds, adopting effective document retention policies. You'd be surprised how often it becomes an issue. But at the end of the day, I think establishing a robust system of controls for financial disclosure and regulatory compliance will arm cannabis companies and their young executives with the ammunition that they need to defend securities class actions in the cannabis space. And what's interesting is that a lot of this advice is not limited to cannabis companies. This is good corporate compliance risk management strategy. But it's amazing how often we see it fall by the wayside in this young industry.
Yeah, and that's why they've become sophisticated companies, as I was saying, right? I mean, there was a time period you had a client who was a drug dealer yesterday, right? Like literally, and now it's legal. And, you know, we're telling them start doing X, Y, and Z, you know, and they're like, what are you talking about? Hey, I've never followed rules, but things have changed, or like you're saying, you know, these are now, you know, private equity money comes in, more sophisticated capital comes in. They want to have a board seat, you know. Well, guess what? You know, the person with the criminal background is going to get kicked out of the board. I've dealt with that because the new money coming in wants a clean board. They don't want to have a, you know, quote unquote criminal from the old days on the board. So as the companies grow and become like the other established companies, are going to have to follow through with all the rules and ways of conducting themselves, as you've talked about. So it's going to give a lot more work for lawyers, including young lawyers, going forward.
And Aram, you like one of the things Ara said that I thought was quite interesting, that like from my own experience being at these kind of the real cowboy days when you would sort of like, we need access to the EU. What's that worth? Oh, well, it's worth $500 million. It's worth, you know, it's worth however much. It's truly a green field, and we can't not be there. And you need to look no further than some of that Canadian green rush to see like all the kinds of operations and, you know, massive scale that was built in places that didn't even have control frameworks. So curious about Narineh and Aram in California right now, when you have conversations around asset valuations, or you have like real just kind of nitty gritty corporate commercial discussions with people and you're advising, does that consideration of like, look, like we don't even know what this is going to look like. And I guess California is a bit more mature, but even in Canada, like in my current business, there are valuations that are completely out to lunch, and you'll have a conversation on a Monday and somebody will think they're getting X. And then on a Friday, it'll be 30% of that, and it'll just that dynamism doesn't happen anywhere else. So curious if you guys have encountered that on the corporate side in California.
Definitely, we have encountered that. Just kind of want to go back a little bit about, moving clients from the traditional market to the legal market. A very important soft skill for an attorney to have is to understand that client and understand where they're coming from. These are people who have been taught for a very long time. You don't text anything, you don't talk about anything, you keep no records of anything. Everything is on a handshake basis. To take a person who's been trained and learned and built their brand based on that, and then to tell them, okay, now you need to track every single time you move the cannabis from this room to that room, and who went into your limited access area and who picked up the product. There's a lot of trust involved. It's a soft skill that you do need to develop. But what we are seeing, especially with our clients here, as they're, taking our advice, as they are trusting that, the legal market is the place to be, because actual investors are now coming in. Something interesting that we're able to do at our office here. Just a little bit of background about the firm that I work at. My boss has been a part of the cannabis industry for over 35 years. This is public knowledge at this point, but he represented Jack Herrera back in the day. If you guys know about that strain. He represented him in the Supreme Court. So, that's just something that he taught me. He's like, before anything, you need to be able to communicate that, these people do want to move towards legalization, because as much money as the black market makes, there's much bigger potential in the legal market. And where we see that is in branding. And, some like a brand like cookies, everyone can identify cookies. You have a cookies hat on, you wear a cookie shirt, like it's easily identifiable. And that's the best example of a traditional market going legal, attracting investors that have money. And, the way we value it, we, kind of moving on from cannabis, we have a lot of industry professionals that we work with, something that I believe like we all experience. In cannabis, everything is about teamwork. You need an entire team of people. There's professionals that can come in and give a valuation for how much your company is worth. And you can get professional opinions, and they'll drop a business plan with a 5-year pro forma showing what your growth potential is. So when more traditional business people see that, it's understandable to them. So it transitions from, the traditional criminal selling drugs to, like you're building a brand, and it's something that will go public. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. And what you put into the company, you can benefit from a financial point.
So Narineh, if I'm hearing correctly, which I think that's such a wonderful point, and I love that you brought up cookies, because I think there's anybody in Canada hears the word cookies and just sheds a single tear, being like, man, cookies. But it sounds like there's a real opportunity here. And I myself have sort of recently downscaled my sort of practice focus in the cannabis industry and picked up much more of a business advisory and sort of commercial lens. But it sounds like from your practice as well, and Aram, and as like in his sort of from his purview, there's a ton of opportunity for you, not just to be a legal advisor, but a business advisor too. And Absolutely. I think that's a great point to get into, because I know a lot of lawyers like that's kind of one of the things they struggle with, or not struggle with, but they don't want to just outline the case. It's more so, I want to be your trusted advisor, and I want to give you situations and outcomes that are going to minimize your downside risk, but really give you the upside of doing things compliantly and building that brand, as it were. So if you could expand on that, I think that'd be super valuable.
Absolutely. As I mentioned, as we are becoming more complex and more sophisticated in the cannabis industry, we are seeing kind of smaller pockets of new professionals that are coming in. We have professional consultants that come in and that can help you with your business plan, and to actually go out and find a team of, what a lot of California licensing agencies are requiring is they want locals, they want social reform, they want you to be involved in the community. So there are professionals that can literally do that for you. They can help put a team together for you. If you have I have a client that, they're a sophisticated enough business where they have a professional trimming business where they can come into your cultivation site as leased employees. So they're not your employees. It's basically a consulting or managing service that they provide. And they come in, they take care of everything for you. From a branding point of view, there are branding agencies that can help you move ahead. So there's just a lot of opportunities depending on what your particular interests are to really be immersed in this industry and to grow within it. The opportunities really, they're endless. Like we see a lot of issues coming up in different sectors. Like, obviously we have the contracts issues, we have the torts issues, but we're starting to see property issues. We're starting to see issues with waste and water and impacts of emissions. And what do you do about, things like that? What do you do about workers' comp issues? What do you do when you have a when you have a state trademark, but it's, violated in another state? So there's a lot of different opportunities for different lawyers, depending on what their interests are. So I think as we move towards a more sophisticated market, the opportunities are just really growing, and it's amazing to see. I love it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like what you just said is so resonant for me, because the idea that you enter the space thinking, it's cannabis law, you're only going to deal with, like, honestly, like you actually get the stigma discussion first and foremost, where someone's like, oh, I mean,
I kind of fall into the stigma, so
yeah, no, but the stigma itself is so tired. Like, I think it really, and like maybe this is sort of a logical progression of it, but what draws me to cannabis, and not to like tie into, it's just people are so wrong about it.
Sure.
They're just so off and so wrong. And this idea, you're talking about the guy who used to break his burner up and throw it in the garbage after he would do a drop, and it's like, why does this guy have to, like, this guy's an artist. He's doing something beautiful. He's cultivating something that looks beautiful, smells great, and is like, and is legal, just depending on where you are in the United States, over a bridge, and has its own sort of like life here. And it's just an arbitrariness that I find that so much is still, the stigma perpetuates the arbitrariness. And I wonder if you guys when you say sort of like, my practice involves cannabis law, if you still encounter that stigma, from your colleagues or even from your other colleague.
Less and less. It is getting reduced for sure.
Right.
But early on, yeah, it was like, what are you doing dealing with those types of people? What do you mean those types of people? They're very talented businessmen and women. We represent small to mid-sized middle market businesses. That's what they are. So you just have to take the extra step and explain it.
When you characterize it that way, it's just, they're in a high growth vertical. And I find that to be like a good way to kind of like push it back. Like, really, what's the real use? And then, there's a bunch of larger, more sophisticated people just looking at the development of the space. And that every, 6 to 12 months, you'll hear about some cornerstone deal where I think British American Tobacco just staked a Canadian licensed producer a few months ago called Organigram with a $250 million strategic investment to basically start building vapes as part of their reduced risk platform. And so it's kind of funny that the stigma persists, and yet the mature sort of money is on the sidelines and kind of banking these Canadian entities that, are over, what we want to call it, regulated to a point that it's like, it's not, we have an illicit market problem here in Canada, not to like get a little bit, just to talk about the illicit market and how it segues into our next topic of discussion. I think cannabis today is quite a misunderstood substance. Like, I think the cannabis that is consumed today, like the number of people that are smokers is the highest today it's ever going to be, because the idea of smoking is inherently bad. And I found that to be such a funny misnomer about medical cannabis. It's like, I understand the therapeutic benefits of it, but combustion itself, and this is coming from somebody who's working tobacco, is like a net negative. When you do an inhaled, when you burn something and inhale it, that's just, there's no grounds on which that's good for your health. So as the products evolve, as the formats evolve, as the stigma sort of like melts away from all that, I'm curious about what the future of cannabis looks like, and what, you know, how we're talking about it today, but how we'll talk about it as industry veterans, even 2, 3, 4 years from now, let alone 15 years from now, when this thing's actually had some real time to mature. What are some things you guys are seeing in your practice? And I'll let Narineh lead this one, about the future of cannabis, and where that excitement and that sort of new legal issues and questions that haven't even been contemplated are emerging in your practice on a daily basis.
Sure. I appreciate that. I definitely do think we are moving towards legalization, as far as it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. We're seeing a lot of intersections between Canadian companies as well as California companies. I think you mentioned earlier that you worked for Tilray.
I used to work for Afria, yeah, Afria, which is merged with Tilray, but I think they had some stigma on their former corporate name, so they took Tilray's name, but Tilray also has some stigma on its name. So anyway,
I see. You know, they just did like an acquisition deal with MedMen, which is a huge company out here. I think it was like for, I think it was like in the $200 million range. So that's a huge merger. Ease is another one. Ease just did like a huge, like multi-$100 million deal. Same with Leafly. So we are seeing a lot of money pouring into cannabis. We are seeing really major mergers and acquisitions. Obviously, what this is going to bring up are a lot of tax issues. Something we desperately need in the cannabis space are tax attorneys that understand what to do. A lot of, you know, California companies that started out before the adult use market, in the medical market, their tax, you know, the way they paid taxes was completely different. So right now, purchasing a company is almost a nightmare, because you're running into tax issue after tax issue after tax issue. So that's definitely a segment that, you know, is extremely problematic. And it's just a growing pain. As we become more sophisticated, we're going to have to figure it out. But of course, you know, one of the biggest issues in cannabis right now, and moving forward, especially given how much money is pouring into this industry right now, is that it's still predominantly a cash-based business. We're having a lot of trouble with banking. You know, believe it or not, even law firms that accept money from cannabis companies, they, you know, they close down our accounts. We're in a City National building, and we used to have a bank account here, and they shut us down, and we've had to change banks multiple times. So, you know, not even being directly in the industry, but being, you know, on the outskirts and advising, you know, we're running into those issues. Dealing with the cash-based business, you deal with a lot of theft. I have a client who just had basically their facility cleaned out. You know, what do you do? How do you report that? You know, in the United States, anything above $10,000, any transaction above $10,000, you need to submit some sort of IRS form. So, yeah, I mean, it becomes extremely difficult. So what we're seeing and how we're seeing the market transition is, one, there's alternative banking solutions that are emerging. There's companies that actually come by, they take your cash and they keep it for you for a ridiculous percentage. But what we're also seeing now is that there's an intersection between cannabis and cryptocurrency, which is a very odd but sensical merger. You know, these are two very hyped up industries right now, and they seem to work in unison, you know, where, you know, you can move away from the cash only industry where, you know, your employees are safer, because if you're not working with cash, then your employees are not getting robbed, your facility isn't being broken into. But, you know, with that, there's a lot of tax issues that are coming up, and we're kind of operating in this gray market. I don't know if I've talked about it yet, but I have a client who came up with a really interesting idea, and he was, you know, we're just going back and forth about like what he wants to do next. And he was like, I'd like to set up a vending machine that accepts cryptocurrency, and I want to sell cannabis through a vending machine. can I do it? You know, and that's just such an interesting issue, and there's no real answer. And that kind of points to the issues that we have in the regulatory market, where technology advances so quickly that it's very difficult for the law to keep up. And unfortunately, you know, cannabis just kind of stays in this gray area because we need solutions now. So we're looking for solutions now, but, you know, with the regulatory and legal framework, it's extremely difficult, but, you know, we're trying to work it out.
Well, I mean, that crypto vending machine thing. So Aram, help me out here. Like the SEC, the ATF, like how many federal bodies would want to have oversight on that transaction for like what? For an eighth?
For an eighth?
Yeah.
and then the bureaucrat has a simple out of, well, this isn't federally legal yet, right? So they're going to take the easy way out and not approve it. So that's pretty tough. What was going through my head real quick, Mark, about stigma was whether Ara thinks the stigma is still going to be out there for juries and judges and litigants. You know, I get the business folks understanding it. I get capital understanding it. I get everything Narineh said about where the future's headed. But today, I mean, what's your take about how the normal person on the street deals with two shareholders in a cannabis company that are fighting with each other, you know, or any other example like that?
Yeah.
I think the stigma has certainly worn off, at least in Canada. I think just listening to our California colleagues describe the regulatory challenges that they're experiencing, it reminds me that few industries in the world actually present more complex legal issues than the growing legal cannabis industry. And the host of contractual, employment, bankruptcy, and insolvency issues that are brought to bear in this industry just shows how intellectually challenging and stimulating it is to practice in this space.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you're thinking about cannabis law, all right, to your point, like you're truly entering Terra Nova. Like there is no precedent for the kinds of questions like when Narineh mentioned that, like there's 50 different places you can go with that. There's 50 different answers, not even answers, like it truly is like the technology piece that you layer on top of that. And just even looking at Canada, like from the technology of the actual formats that are allowed in the legal market for sale. So we've got this weird arbitrariness about format restrictions on edibles where you can't do more than 10 milligrams of THC per the Health Canada, which is, I understand the policy behind that and so on and so forth. But just on the market, yet 2 days ago, another licensed producer introduced I think it was called a mint lozenge, which is candy. And they were able to basically finesse into the existing extracts class that this was not a edible. No, this is an extract. And all of a sudden they've got a minty, they've got a mint with 10 pack with 10 mgs each. And they've like innovated, like, and some lawyer thought of that argument, put that argument in front of his business partner. The business partner said, like, yeah, I think I see it. They went to Health Canada. They were like, we're going to do this. And Health Canada was like, okay, yeah. Like, so that's kind of like to Narineh's point, like there are so many, like creative lawyers can really, really make a difference. Just learning how the system works and learning how even administrative procedures go from being, you know, a startup company to like a startup company that does something that's super illegal and verboten. And the kind of growth you can have in your career is amazing. So I do want to make sure we have time for Q&A as well. So if anybody on the chat has any questions, please, by all means, hit us up. I don't want to stifle the discussion. Aram, you were saying.
Yeah, I was just saying also, I mean, you're absolutely right about being creative, et cetera, but also, you know, caring for the client, because in many ways you're trying to help them not step in it, right? You're trying to help them protect them from themselves, right? So that is also a very gratifying feeling. You know, they make the ultimate decision on what to do. We're just advisors, we recommend, but it's nice to be able to tell them, look, for your own good, do what Ara's saying, you know, follow through on the rules, on the governance correctly. And they usually remember that when things go well.
Oh, it's very rare that you'll have the specter of jail time float over, like to be able to say to your, managing director to be like, look, here's what the law says. Right. And there are potential jail implications, even though it's never, it would be a pretty high bar, even in Canada, but it does add a certain weight and have to, like, your role as the legal advisor, you're kind of more than that. You're almost you're woven into the fabric of the business. So yeah, if there's no questions, I'm not sure. There might be one. Yes, there is an open question. Okay, so we got a question from Mike Khodadadian. Are we going to be able to walk on the public lands in Sierra Nevada or go birding near the coast without coming across illegal grows? Oh, this is actually an interesting question. What about the conflict with neighbors about road use, development, big issue in Sonoma and Mendocino counties, but seemingly okay in Humboldt? It's a settled, accepted agricultural issue in some counties, but not others. I'm going to turn this over to our California colleagues, but this is the kind of, I like to learn about California.
Yeah, I mean that happens. I'm also an avid hiker, but putting that aside, Desert Hot Springs has, I think, like a 0.1% tax, something outrageous, if not even no tax. You could go and grow anything you want anywhere there. It's completely crazy, right? Costa Mesa was restrictive at first. Other places are harder to sort of deal with. So it's a hodgepodge. Forget about the state and the federal divide. The counties and cities within counties are all over the place. Again, good for lawyers because we can help with those issues, but not really good for the businessmen and women. But Narineh, what's your take on that?
I have nothing different to add to that. I completely agree with you. Even from our end, it could be a little frustrating just because you think you know, and then that very county can just change it up on you immediately. So kind of to just reiterate, it is extremely stimulating. You do always need to be on top of everything. As far as, the different counties and cities, it's also really important to understand the population. It's really important to understand the communities. Going back to what I was saying about, there are professional services now. Before you get licensed, before you spend like $5 million on a piece of land and develop a $20 million facility where you're going to have neighbors across the street that absolutely hate you, and they're going to, call the cops every single time they see you, and they're just going to make your lives miserable. It's really important to, advise your clients to get to really know the neighborhood. There are some places that are totally fine, like places like Palm Springs. They love it out there. There are lounges. You can really have a good time out there. But then you go to like San Bernardino, and it's going to be a completely different attitude towards you. So it is definitely a learning curve. It's ever changing, but that's kind of what keeps it interesting, really.
And I mean, if you want to grow cannabis in a greenhouse, by all means, come on up to Canada, because we've got just so many of those we built, like truly and honestly, so many greenhouses. Yeah. And I'm sure Ara can sort of speak to that as well too. That's a great answer. I love that. And learning about the sort of, I feel like the California market is kind of what Canada dreams of when it goes to bed. Like when it's sleeping, it's like one day we're about the same size population. We think we'll get there. And then you look at sort of the actual consumption of it. And we got another one here from, we got another question. I guess this is sort of the last one from Kanar. How would each of you feel if a dispensary opened a couple of blocks from your residence? That's a good sort of like, tell me something about yourself.
Can I answer that? So
yes.
What's totally crazy is that, I'm the head of our cannabis practice at a national firm, but locally I'm a council member where I live. So with my money-making hat on, I'm all for it. With my council hat on, I voted against it because I don't want a dispensary down the street with some of the potential, not definite, potential negative impacts that come with it. So in my town, we don't have any dispensaries.
Well, there's one a few blocks from my house, so I don't have a choice.
There you go.
And guys, right now I'm in retail vertical. Like that's my part of the value chain, and sort of to go off script here. But I actually think you're right and wrong. So you're right in that like retail today is some weird garish nightmare of like a legacy head shop mashed up with an Apple store,
Right.
mashed up with a shaman's basement that's got like some places in Cali have that like strong patchouli odor. And then other places are like, hi, like this is a Scandinavian bathroom. What experience are you looking to ascend to with our curated whatever? So it's sort of like part of what and not to like talk about my current employer, but like what I like about what we're doing in Canada, it's almost like boring. It's boringly disruptive. Is like we're creating a cannabis retailer that's just like we're a retailer, like a place that's got parking, well lit, it's got screens, just it's cheap, like it's like very cheap because it's not like a no frills experience, but it's almost like insert retail experience, but just make the thing that they're selling cannabis. And I'm super crazy about it because it's this idea that you just said where it's like, I don't want the guy with his bongos or the people that are lining up at 9 a.m. Like that legacy of like, right. Which is I think it's a minority of the population, but has such an outspoken influence on sort of stigma and people's ideas. So one of the like, being boringly disruptive is what I always tell people is because like we just like, oh, you're going out to buy, you know, milk or home hardware or whatever. I was like, oh, I'm going to pick up some cannabis too. And it's going to be like stepping in, you're in and out in 90 seconds. There's nobody who's like, oh, I just made these brownies. Like, I don't actually know. In California, I've heard some wild stories. My run through the state itself was like, you know, you couldn't find the same products in 5 different dispensaries. Like, it's sort of like the big guys, but there was always like, oh yeah, these like heart squares. Like, I know a guy who makes them in Humboldt or whatever. But that's sort of the next wave of this is the idea that it's just sort of picking up anything. So I would say maybe you would be opposed to the idea of the traditional dispensary arm, but the boring one, hopefully, you would not vote against in the future.
Right. Makes sense.
So yeah, I think that brings us to the hour. If there's any other questions? No, I guess not. Guys, I will just like take this opportunity. It was a pleasure for everybody on the line live and everybody who's watching this on December 30th. Aram, Ara, Narineh, thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your wonderful, just sharing during this panel. And big thanks to the Armenian Bar Association as well for hosting us this evening on their Zoom channel. And hopefully it was something valuable. Reach out if you have any questions, and have a wonderful morning or night whenever it is you're watching this.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Take care.